All right. How's it going, everybody? This is Rabbi Asher Meza. I have a very interesting individual on the line, Mr. Rosman from New York, here to shed light on a few issues. There's a few questions I've been asking myself in the past week. I'm sure it's no secret that many people are aware that there's a little feud going on between me and Reuven about me accusing him of charging money for conversions. Whether he charges or the Beit Din charges, it's not that important. But a big question I've been asking myself is what Yaron does, is it actually a net positive for the Jewish community or a net negative? And I had a very interesting individual who contacted me who wanted to chime in on the issue. He's been researching Yaron's organization, not just Yaron, but his Rav Muvhak, Rabbi Mizrachi's organization. And I want to see if he wants to try to answer that question. So welcome, Mr. Rosman.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Ultimately, what Yaron does with all his classes and his form of kiruv, if that is a net gain for the Jewish community or really a net loss?
I believe it's a net loss. Many of the families who listen to him, they are secular Bukharians who want to increase their knowledge in Limud Torah, but they don't know how. As a result of their teaching their kids to perceive Kol Torah Kula as Yaron's rantings, they are being taught to perceive Kol Torah Kula as Gehenna. And I believe this is a negative asset that what he does.
Before we say too much, first let me mention that Mr. Rosman doesn't agree necessarily with everything I teach. He may even differ with me as much as Reuven does. But he understands the notion of machloket among Klal Yisrael, that we can disagree in many areas without throwing each other under the bus. That this is ultimately how Judaism functions. Right? We have disagreements mainly on hashkafic issues, but like he said, we don't resort right away to use the term Gehenna or kofar or min like it's going out of style. The problem you see with Reuven, is it mainly in the rhetoric or in what these kids end up becoming by entering his program?
I would say the problem is the way these kids are being transmitted to perceive the Das Moshe Yisrael. Like, I grew up from birth, Baruch Hashem, I had a very positive outlook on Yiddishkeit, growing up and going to the mainstream institutions. However, these kids, they're being taught to perceive Judaism, everything Judaism, as Gehinom, and no Darchinayom. And I think that's detrimental to getting these kids into proper integration into the Frum community, which is what the goal of kiruv is. It's not just about getting people to do more mitzvot, it's also about getting them to have a healthy relationship with halacha and be capable of functioning in the mainstream setting, like Rabbi Buchwald does.
So would you say that it's not prudent for us to bring people to Torah solely on the basis of fear and gloom and doom, but perhaps they should fall in love with Hashem, like fall in love with His creation, and then come to the realization that through that love, there has to be standards, right? It's not the other way around. It seems like, in my opinion, these individuals are being scared into being religious, and that typically will determine how long they remain religious. And I've seen it many times that many people, they do tshuva under the wrong auspices. And what happens is that they end up dropping it. And not that they just drop Yiddishkeit in general, they drop the belief in God and become stark atheists who fight against ultimately what Halakha calls a mumar lechachis. I mean, someone who's now angry because he feels either misled. That's what we're trying to avoid here. Now, people shouldn't think that Rabbi Mizrachi and Reuven is the only outlet out there that young Sephardi Bukharian guys have in doing kiruv.
Unfortunately, for many families, that's what it seems to be.
That we're here to let them know that Yiddishkeit is a lot more colorful than that. That, you know what, that we can differ with other Rabbanim, without saying, no, it's only this way or the highway. Because, as you know, your own Reuven has come out with a list of rabbis. I mean, forget about the list. He says that anyone he doesn't endorse is not only not a valid source to learn from, but they're kofrim, they're apikorsim. And this doesn't seem like what we want to be encouraging students to learn.
So, Rabbi Daniel Mechanic, I think it was on December 31st, 2019, when Beth Gavriel and the Chazak were hosting their annual New Year's Eve party, as they call it, where Rabbi Mechanic, he said the following insights. If you want your kids to not run away from Yiddishkeit, you have to be a salesman who draws them in like Apple Products does, making them want it, and not like a policeman who blows his whistle at people who are driving 1 mile over the speed limit. Daron does exactly the latter, and that is detrimental to trying to get these kids to love Yiddishkeit.
Can you tell us a little more about this organization, Chazak?
So, they've not authorized me to speak on their behalf. They run an after-school Talmud Torah to help many of these kids learn Aleph Beis, and they try to push them to transfer from public schools to yeshivas, which teach Torah Lishma. However, many of the parents don't want to pay, so they have this interim Talmud Torah, which helps them somewhat. It's better than nothing. However, some of these kids, they think that their after-school program, it's just they're learning the alphabet of Gehenim and not the alphabet of Torah mitzvahs.
Has Chazak distanced themselves from Rabbi Mizrachi and Yaron Reuven?
Very discreetly they have, so as not to alienate their followers who they're trying to integrate into the mainstream. So a few weeks after Yosef Mizrachi's Holocaust comments became known, Chazak had David Yosef arranged his visit to the Bukharan community, where he encouraged a lot of these families to transfer their kids from public schools to yeshivas. That's just what happened in the sequence of events. I don't know if one led to another, but something tells me that that's what it was.
Well, I know that's where they got their start. Rabbi Mizrachi, his first shiurim online were given under the auspices of Chazak. And, I mean, right. Chazak has been
So Chazak distanced themselves from Yosef Mizrachi after his Holocaust comments. They've not invited him since at least the last time they invited him, I believe, was in October 2015.
What's another problem you have with these individuals? Do you have a problem? Because I know amongst Ashkenazim versus Sephardim, Sheitalach, there's big disagreements. There's many people who can read Aleph Beis who are there giving Musar to a lady pushing a stroller just because she happens to have a Sheitalach.
Yeah, I think that's a very serious problem because these kids, they're going to grow up. They're going to tell their kids, during the COVID lockdown, instead of enhancing our Torah, this is what we were taught, to bark at people. That's what Judaism is, and their kids are going to be completely assimilated into the Goyim.
Yeah, good.
To be a Jew in America, if you want your kids to stay on the derech, you have to convince them, derecheh darkei noyim. You have to convince them that Yiddishkeit offers more geschmack than Shabbat self outings, and your own is completely failing to do that. In contrast to the mainstream yeshivas.
For any parents listening that happens to have their child in this cult that they're pushing, what alternative do you have for their parents? What material do you encourage them to share with their children?
From my understanding, from what I've seen, the parents and the kids listen together. It's not like the kids are being recruited themselves. For someone in the mainstream frum community, if your kid's at risk of listening to him, then they should really turn it off. Have the kids stop watching the videos that might drive the kid off the derech.
Their approach is really nothing new from my perspective. I think they're just following the steps of rabbis like Armon Yitzhak and a hard-line Sephardi approach. But we've also seen in the Sephardi and Israeli world a different approach, like that of Rav Grossman and Migdal Or, which is also based on Darchei Noam and the notion of evolution instead of revolution. Taking your time to be from. Don't rush into it so that you come to burn yourself out and end up hating what you have. but actually taking your time and learning properly that there are, different opinions, there's different types of Jews, and ultimately what unites us is Torah Shebektav and Torah Shebal Peh. That's what makes you a kosher Jew. In terms of looking different, speaking different, dressing different, that shouldn't even be a factor when it comes to Achdus.
Okay, but here's the problem. The hard line approach, it's not going to work. You can't make someone start keeping Shabbos without the full analysis, just by barking at them. You need to give them the full analysis to make them know how to keep Shabbos.
It's not just barking at them, it's scaring them into submission. It's gloom and doom. It's that
but if you do gloom and doom, let's say, if you were to do a gloom and doom approach, let's say regarding sneers for women, these women would be so scared that they would end up wearing a burqa just to look sneers. And that's obviously a design.
So that goes back to my initial statement that becoming from is not the all and all here. It's how long you remain from and how ultimately you make Yiddishkeit look for the next generation. Because how are you able to package this and hand this over to your children, to your grandchildren, if all they see is gloom and doom? If they don't see a beautiful relationship between Hashem and His creation, they see Hashem as a bully, personified by all the stories told by Rabbi Mizrachi and Reuven, that if they do any Aveira in this life, that in their next life they're going to come back as an invalid. Other similar disgusting comments that they've said. Ultimately, what message would you like to give to the Rabbi Mizrachi, Rabbi Yaron Reuven fan out there who's new to Yiddishkeit and thinks that this is all there really is because they make so many videos on YouTube?
Okay, so as an alumnus of the mainstream yeshivas, what comes out of their mouths has no shaykhus to what is taught in the mainstream yeshivas. And if you want to get your kids into the mainstream system, if you want to integrate into it properly, you have to follow a more mainstream path. Like, it is impossible for you to fit into, let's say, a top shiur if you don't even know the Aleph Beis. You have to build the skills gradually.
So again, what steps do you encourage? For example, I always tell people that, you know what, if you began with Rabbi Mizrachi or Yaron Reuven, you shouldn't stay there more than a week or more than a month. In other words, these guys...
What you should do is the following. What they should do is they should have their children transfer from public schools to yeshivas between first and third grade so they can get a head start. The kids between first and third grade can transfer to yeshivas so they can grow up to become in the mainstream-based medrash. Mm-hmm. And that is why I have a fundraiser to help these kids so they can get tuition subsidies and grow up to become mainstream.
If there are people listening in New York right now, where do they go? Where do they inquire?
So they inquire to the shuls they belong to, and then from there, the rabbis who send their kids to yeshivas, so they know that system, they would determine with the various school administrators, which yeshiva will be most appropriate for the child. And there's obviously a very large pool to pick from, given that these kids are mostly living in Long Island, in Nassau County.
Now, there's another spectrum of students out there, right? I mean, it's not just unaffiliated Jews. I would say probably the bulk of all his students are either Gerim or people who are trying to be Megayer. So what advice would you give them?
In this regard, I have to plead the fifth because I'm not very familiar with that field. I'm just an advocate for people who are Jewish from birth and semi-affiliated and want to grow within their own religion. So I can't speak for Gerim because I'm not so familiar with that process. So that's what I have to say regarding people who are interested in being the Megayer and watching these videos.